This morning, I invite you to turn over to the book of Mark. We're going to continue in our study there. And last week, as I described, we have found in the book of Mark 16 chapters, and we're in chapter 11. And Mark, from chapter 11 to 16, describes 1 week. We're in the Passion Week. So everything that, if I were to ask you, if you could know when you're going to die and how you're going to die and the place that you were going to die, certainly we would think that every action that we take, we need to be responsible and that we're always faithful. But it would just draw such an emphasis to that. I think for all of us, we realize this week is so important. Mark identifies that by spending so much time to record that. And Jesus has such a limited time with these disciples. So what he's teaching, we ought to always pay attention when Jesus speaks or anything that he does. But certainly to this week, it has a significant importance. And last week we looked at the cleansing of the temple, and it was very clear that Jesus was doing something to make a statement to those disciples. It says that Jesus went and that he saw it and they came. It was a very definite act, and it was a sense of prophecy for Israel as well. We're going to look at it even greater this morning. But there's just so much to be found in the events that surround this that they make up like a picture. If you see the events there in Mark chapter 11, and you can see how they're all connected if you see it in view of the total of Scripture. But also it's important to take each piece out and see the application for our lives. And sometimes we do well on one and that we don't do so hot on the other, or we will see the application and that we miss the overall real impact of the significance to the gospel message and to what took place and just how earth-shaking that this was. But sometimes we'll spend so much time on the history and the Bible knowledge, but we don't really make an application from it. I hope to do both today, and it is important for us to do both today. The cleansing of the temple. This morning we're going to look at the barren fig tree, the cursing of the fig tree, and how that fits with Israel. And then in the same statement that Jesus talks about faith that moves mountains and talks about prayer and forgiveness. And it's real easy to take each one of those and sort of remove them and look at them and make application, but they are a whole picture. And you'll miss what Jesus is doing throughout the significance of eternity if you don't see them as a whole as well. So I hope to accomplish both of those this morning. I wanted to preach this morning on figs, faith, and forgiveness. That was what I intended to preach on the whole. And there's just so much to be seen in this. So this morning we're going to deal with the barren fig tree. We're going to see the fruitless tree out of Mark chapter 11. And we'll begin reading in verse 11. Mark chapter 11 and verse 11. This kind of goes back to where we were last week as well. Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple, and after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. And on the next day, when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. Seeing at a distance a fig tree in the leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it, and when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves. So it was not the season for figs. He said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples were listening. This is something that's important, and the disciples come back and make that connection later, but it's important enough that his disciples are listening. Verses 15 through 19, he goes and he cleanses the temple. He turns over the tables. He runs out the money changers and all the corruption. And we learned the lesson there that whenever, that in the Old Testament, God had a temple for his people. We're going to look at that in more detail this morning. But after the cross, that God has a people for his temple. We are the temple of God. And he intends to keep his house in order. And he will cleanse the temple. He will come in and overturn those things that we try to keep prevalent in our life when they don't bring glory to his name. He cleans the temple. He continually comes to convict us because he wants to have usable vessels in his service. So that's what happens in verses 15 and 19. You can almost separate the two, but if you do, you're missing the bigger point. But as you go through that cleansing of the temple, then we come back to verse 20. So pick up in verse 20, Mark 11 and verse 20. As they were passing by in the morning, it's on their way, they saw the fig tree withered from the root up. Being reminded, Peter said to him, Peter is Captain Obvious here. Peter said to him, Rabbi, look, the tree which you curse has withered. And Jesus answering said to them, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted him. Therefore I say to you, all things for which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they will be granted you. Whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven will also forgive your transgressions. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father who is in heaven forgive your transgressions. Almost seems like disconnected messages, but they all tie together. We're going to look at the faith and the praying by faith and forgiveness a little later on down the road. But I want us to focus this morning on the fig tree, on the barren fig tree. Some have said that this is the only destructive miracle that Jesus performs. Whenever Jesus came to the fig tree, and unless you have a full appreciation, which I hope we will by the end of this message, then you almost get lost in what takes place here at the fig tree. But Jesus is trying to teach a lesson. And this is not just for our application today. Jesus is making a statement that is earth-shaking in view of Judaism. It is earth-shaking in view of prophecy. It is earth-shaking in how God's dispensation of what God had been doing for so long, trying to bring mankind to a point that we would turn to him and all the tools that he used to be able to do that, and that it had become barren, and that God does a finished work at Calvary. And so this morning, I hope that we can have an appreciation. I don't want to give a history lesson, but you almost have to come to the point to recognize the sinfulness and barrenness of a religion, of a whole people, of generations after generations, a whole story about Israel and Judaism, and to come to this place of this barren fig tree and to know that that has national application. It is about Judaism. It is about the destruction of the symbol of Judaism, what was central, the destruction of the temple. You can almost trace the cycle of apostasy, of the turning away of the whole nation, of the whole religion, if you trace the temple. So I want to do that this morning. I'll try to do that as briefly as I can. I've organized some pictures to try to help us to focus on that. But for you to understand the apostasy and how it was permeating the people and how you see that happening and the barrenness of that religion, you go back to the beginning in Genesis chapter 22, and there's a story about Abraham. You go all the way back to Abraham, where God calls Abraham to follow him as Abram, and he leaves his father's house. And finally, God calls him up after he has had the child of promise. He's been waiting for this child of promise. He's going to have more descendants than all the stars in heaven, but you got to start somewhere. And finally, at the ripe old age of 100, he has this son of promise, Isaac. And God calls him to take Isaac up to the place of Mount Moriah and to offer him as a sacrifice. And Abraham heads there in obedience to God, having faith in God. We understand that Abraham believed that certainly he was going to kill his son and offer him as a sacrifice, but that God was going to do something that he would see him alive again. He didn't know how God was going to work, but he was faithful. And so he heads up there, and there on that place where he lays the altar out and he's about to take his son's life as a sacrifice in obedience to God, God stops him and says, Abraham, I see that your faithfulness is real. And there's that covenant relationship that Abraham has with God. We know that he pulled his son off the altar and God provided a substitute, and they had sacrifice there. And you look back all the way back to there, and it relates to the barren fig tree, because it was on Mount Moriah where Abraham was willing to offer his son in obedience to God. We know the story of the Hebrew people as Abraham had sons, and and the whole story of the mess that we're in. And you listen on the news right now, between his two sons, Ishmael and his son, who the Jews come from, the whole nation of Israel comes from. And so you have the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and then he had son Jacob. And Jacob had sons. And as you see his sons, the 12 sons that he had, one was Joseph, the young son that he loved dearly. His brothers hated the story how they sold him off into slavery. He wound up in Egypt as a slave. And then as a slave, he rose as God. He was faithful. God brought him to power. He was the prime minister of Egypt. And there the world had a famine, and because of Joseph's faithfulness, God's faithfulness, then he brought his whole family there. And they enjoyed being saved not only from the famine, but to be enriched in Egypt. But there arose a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. And then they became in bondage, and they cried out to God. And God raised up Moses, and Moses goes off into the wilderness, and as he comes back, he is a deliverer of the people, and God brings them back to a place, and God gives them a new covenant. And they are to obey him. And God gives the Mosaic covenant, the laws that God is going to be their God, that they're going to be their people. He's going to give them a promised land. But Moses goes up on the mountain, and the people can't remain faithful enough, even for a period of days, for him to go up on the mountain. And they already start disobeying. They start looking for something else to worship, and they force Aaron to form a golden calf, and they worship a golden calf. Moses comes down, and he pitches a little fit, and everybody is terrified, and God just comes to a point to reality to say, you cannot obey, you cannot do what I tell you to do. And you start seeing that very cycle as it begins from the very beginning. So they're trying to keep the law. Through the wilderness wanderings, they've been given a sacrificial system, how they can relate back to God, and they keep messing up. They continue to sin. And so God gives them in that law the tabernacle. We know the tabernacle was just a tent, but it was tabernacled. It was in the midst of the camp. It's where God chose to bring his glory and display before the people. They brought their offerings because they knew they were sinners. They knew that they needed to be to pay for their sin. They needed to offer, but they didn't have anything. So God would take a substitute, just as he did with Abraham, and they would offer their sacrifices there on the altar. And that went on for years. And you come to the time, almost 900 years after Abraham on Mount Moriah, the nation of Israel has gone in and claimed the promised land. And now then David stands and he says in Jerusalem, you know what, I have a really nice house as king. We're still worshiping God in a tabernacle, in a tent. I want to build something for God. Well, David didn't get to do it, but he collected many of the materials. And so you come to the time where David bought Mount Moriah. Here's the city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem. Here is Mount Moriah. That's where Mount Moriah, and that is the very spot where Abraham was willing to offer his son, where Abraham fulfilled that covenant, that he was obedient to God. On that very spot, Mount Moriah, is where Solomon built the temple. As David bought it, 1 Chronicles 21 or 22 tells about where he bought that with the intention of it, and that is where Solomon built the temple. Now, Solomon's temple, as he built it, they collected from all the people. David gave so much toward it, and it was just magnificent. It was not as huge of a building as we'll see Herod's was, but you'll see this little cross section of Solomon's temple, and you see all the gold that is there by today's value. Some have said that it could be worth up to $20 trillion. Do you realize that that's more than our national debt? That's how much that the temple would be valued from all the valuable things. Well, the people had a temple. They had been blessed by God. They couldn't remain faithful. They wouldn't do what God told them to do. They wouldn't be faithful to the covenant that God established with Abraham and God established through Moses. They had the law, and the law was there for them to understand that they couldn't do it on their own. They had to submit to God. And every year they came and they said, we realize that it is completely dependent upon you. They would offer their sacrifices, but they continued to mess up. Sounds like my testimony. They continued to mess up. And God sent prophet after prophet after prophet, and he said, listen, you have to remain true. You have to repent. You have to come back to me. But if you're a Jew, the way that you're a Jew is because you related all the way back in the line and lineage, all the way back to Abraham when it all started. And so it was important for them to maintain their loyalty in that line and lineage. If you're a Jew, it's like on a ladder, the rungs of the ladder, it all comes back to Abraham, where that's where a Jew comes from. That's where the nation of Israel comes from. But they would go outside and marry outside of that loyalty. And God told them, don't do that. That there is a significant part of what takes place in the covenant. Don't do that. And not only would they marry, but they would take on the customs of the other people. And then they would start worshiping the other gods and the false gods. Even some came and tore down the altars of God and erected altars and offered sacrifices to the false gods. And God kept warning them and calling them to repentance, prophet after prophet, and they wouldn't listen. And finally God said, that is enough. And so God brings judgment to them, and they are carried off into captivity. You see, as they are carried away from their land, through the time that as they're carried around, the land is left, the temple is destroyed. The Babylonians, the final blow of the Babylonian Empire was to come in and to destroy the temple in 587 BC. And so they're away in this vast kingdom. The Babylonian captivity engulfed the land. And as they're away, then they said, what have we done? We had a relationship with the one true God. We had a way that we could come and identify with him. We had a place in the temple where we could see and experience the very presence of the one true God, and that we could not remain faithful. We won't do that again. We're not going to marry outside, and we're not going to go after false gods, and we're not going to do the Baal worship, and we're not doing that again. And as they come back, you have the story about as God brings them back, and the story of Nehemiah rebuilding the wall, and Ezra and Zerubbabel of the temple. And they rebuilt the temple. They reestablished temple worship. But this time, instead of them adulterating their religion by going off and worshiping Baal gods or false gods, then they started looking to themselves and saying, we're not going to mess up that again. And we're going to set up some rules to where we're not going to stray from that again. And then they started feeling good about how they could set up the rules and how they could follow the rules. And they'd take the law and they'd interpret it into hundreds of different applications. And if you could do all this, then you felt good about yourself. And then they started to adulterate, not by false gods of worship away from God, but their own self-righteousness. And as you see that, God just continues to bring judgment upon them. And like he does often, that he brings circumstances from outside. There was an outside power that came on, the Greco-Syrian kingdom empire, the Seleucid empire. And one of their rulers, Antiochus IV, who was just a rascal. I mean, he was just a terrible man. And he was afraid, he wanted to keep the Romans, that empire was starting to build, and he wanted to keep them at bay. So in his mind, he had to annex and overcome Egypt. Well, to get to Egypt meant he had to bring this little nation who was a nuisance to him of Israel under submission. So he did everything he could to irritate the Jews and to beat them down. He went into the temple, and he desecrated the temple by putting an idol, a huge idol of Apollos, of Jupiter in the temple. He desecrated the temple by offering pigs on the altar as sacrifice. I mean, he did everything to stir up the Jews, and he was certainly a man that was trying to bring a Hellenization, the Greek influence, to all the world. And then within the Jewish sect, within Judaism, the religion, there were those that kind of adopted that Greek influence. We see that all the way into the New Testament. That's where the Pharisees and the Sadducees, those traditionalists and those more moderate, those Hellenistic Sanhedrin. Well, the Jews finally got tired. So they finally revolted, and for a temporary time, and we don't hear a lot about this because this is an interbiblical period from the time you come to Malachi to Matthew. During that time is when this is taking place, and the Maccabees are the ones, and if you've studied world history, the Maccabean revolt that took place, and they came in and reestablished temple worship for a simple time. And one of the things that we as Baptists don't know a whole lot about, but in Judaism, even now, the menorah, the story of Hanukkah is surrounding the Maccabean revolt. And supposedly what happened, they took back over, they reestablished the temple, recommitted, rededicated the temple, cleansed the temple. And during that time, there was only one bottle of oil, of olive oil, of fuel for the lampstand from the Old Testament. That's the menorah. The lampstand, they only had enough oil to fuel the lampstand for one day until they could go and procure more oil. And miraculously, they say that it burned for 8 days. And so that's what Hanukkah is. It's a celebration about the rededication of the temple that took place during this time. But it was still a time where they were dependent upon themselves. And whenever you come to the time of Jesus, the Roman Empire has taken over, and there's all sorts of conflicts that take over. And you can look, there's a man with the Roman Empire started putting people that they would be loyal to Rome, but could rule the people and the Roman interest and make sure they got all their taxes and make sure that there was no rebellion that took place. And so they installed this guy, Herod the Great. There were a whole list of Herods, a whole family of Herods, but he is the one who was Herod the Great whenever Jesus was born. And you see that he is known for how ruthless he was, and he was terrible. But one of the things he was known for is that he was prideful about construction. And so he built, and the temple had already been built, but he renovated, and some call it the third temple, but it's really a renovation of the second temple. He renovated it and expanded it. There's a comparison in size. The big one is Herod's temple. The other one is Solomon's temple. But Herod's temple, as far as the value, was nothing to compare to Solomon's temple. But you see that Herod established that. So when Jesus is born, the temple is back. They're in full mode of temple worship, of altar, of coming back, reestablished in Judaism. They're not going off adulterating Judaism with the world any longer, but it is a self-righteousness. And that's why you see Jesus over and over again with the elders and with the priests and with the scribes, with those leaders in Israel, that Jesus is constantly in combat with them, because they are all about the religion. They're all about the show. They're all about self-righteousness and how they can feel about it. And so the primary interpretation of this is that Jesus comes and cleanses the temple, and he gives the lesson that has a national implication that God is going to bring judgment upon that religion, and that the temple, the symbol of it, is going to lay waste. Well, we know the Romans eventually in 70 A.D., General Titus came in and he destroyed Jerusalem. And there was not one stone left on top of the other on the temple. Jesus is predicting that in his actions whenever he cleanses the temple, and in his allegory as he curses the fig tree. They are connected. They have a national implication. But if you come to the story as we're told about how this occurs, you have to realize that this is a national application. That's why it says, and the disciples were listening. They learned that lesson. So whenever they come into after the day of Pentecost and they stand and they say, if you're going to be saved, you've got to leave Judaism. That's what they were saying. You can't stay and continue in Judaism and follow Christ. And that's why for you to come, for you to be saved, then you have to turn and repent. And you have to be baptized. It's not saying that we've got to go through the waters of baptism, but that was a sign for those men in Jerusalem at that time. You have to forsake. You can't continue in Judaism and follow after Christ. This is something new. This is a fulfillment. This is what God has brought as salvation, and he has fulfilled all that. Why did he give the law? Why do we have the law? Is it so that we can check off the rules and feel good about it? That's self-righteousness. He gave us a law for us to understand we can't do this. We can't keep the law. I keep messing up. What was the significance of coming on the Day of Atonement, the high priest coming into the temple and offering the blood? Was that just to get them good for another year? Is that all that was? No. It was to teach a lesson that the Lamb of God would come and that he would shed his blood, and he would be the substitute. Just like that ram on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, whenever Abraham came, there was a substitute. Just every year, whenever they came in the atonement and the high priest would come in, there was a substitute. And whenever they would lay the sins of the people and the scapegoat would take it off, it was a substitute to teach a lesson that that's what Jesus was doing on the cross. And so you have to kind of see that this is huge. When Jesus is talking about the barren fig tree, he is talking about what God's plan of salvation has been all along. It has not been through Judaism, and he came up with another plan on the cross. It has been through Judaism to be a sign to understand finally when you come to the cross that these are what the symbols have all pointed to, and it points to Jesus. And so it is a big deal. I know I've spent a lot of time with this concerning history, but you have to see this, that it had a national application. But for us, what is the significance for us to learn? You come to the fig tree, it has a national application, but it also has a lesson for us. Look again in verse 12, it says, and Jesus came and he was hungry. Jesus was about heading to the temple and cleanse the temple. It was a formidable day. He had a hard day ahead of him. He had gone the night before and made a survey, saw what was taking place. He knew what he was going to do. And he saw the fig tree. Well, you kind of have to understand about fig trees in Palestine. I've read a lot this week about fig trees in Palestine. I know far more about fig trees in Palestine than I really ever wanted to know. But it's important to interpret this. Jesus came and he was hungry. Pause there for just a minute. This great God, this past week we have talked about Colossians 1, about this great God, the creator of all the universe, this great God who knows the visible and invisible, this great God who created all things, and in him and through him all things have been made. This great God is hungry. It just shows the greatness of God as he condescends and he takes on the form of humanity, and he's hungry. Today, whatever your need is, Jesus is the only answer, but also Jesus understands. He's hungry. He's coming into a very formidable day. He needs something to eat. So look in verse 13. And verse 13 causes confusion for some folks. Seeing at a distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. You have to know some basic facts about fig trees in Palestine to have an interpretation of this. Let me just say, don't get lost in all of this. The most important thing for you to know about fig trees is that for a fig tree bears fruit before it puts on the young leaves. So if you see a fig tree that's got young leaves, it's supposed to have fruit. Now the fig trees in Palestine, say that 3 times real fast. The fig trees in Palestine have 2 crops of figs. There is where the wood from last year was the new wood, where the old wood has grown before the new leaves come on, there is the first crop of figs. Those are called the bribas, and they are green and they're kind of hard. They're not sweet, but they are edible. And that's what Jesus was looking for whenever he came here. And then those are around Passover time, around early spring is whenever that crop is available. And then the new wood that grows, then the main crop of figs is grown on that. Those are the ones that we're more familiar with, that they're tender and sweet. And Jesus comes and it says it wasn't time for figs. It wasn't time for the main crop of figs. Here's the lesson to learn. We have a reference to those early figs. Hosea chapter 9, verse 10. He said, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your forefathers at the earliest fruit on the fig tree in the first season. So that second crop of figs is the sweet figs. If you see young, tender leaves on a fig tree, then there should already be fruit on it. If you come and you see young, tender leaves on a fig tree and that briba's not there, that early fig's not there, then that means there's not going to be any fruit on that tree. that means that tree is barren. That's the lesson that Jesus is trying to give, a word of warning, and from that is where we make application. And it is the barren fig tree is a lesson about fruitfulness. If you see leaves, and that's why it represented Israel, because there were a lot of leaves, but there was no fruit. And the leaves represent religious activity and religious appearance, but there's no fruit to it. And that's what had happened to Judaism. Judaism was all about religious show. It was all about religious appearance. It was all about self-righteousness. And that's what the leaves. Now here's a lesson about a fig tree. Number one is that the leaves represent to us self-righteousness. And number two, the figs, of course, represent fruitfulness. Self-righteousness seen in the leaves. If you want to really understand this, go all the way back to the garden. The Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve are told, you've got all of this beautiful garden. Tend it, have fun, have a ball, eat all you want, except don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what did they do? They did. They ate from the tree. And whenever they came, then what happened to them? Their eyes were open. And whenever their eyes were open, in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7, it says, then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. They were trying to cover up their shame. Their eyes were open. They knew that they'd done what was wrong, and they were ashamed of it. They had been naked before, but there was no shame in that. And now then, whenever they disobeyed God, shame came to them. Look what they do next. In verse 8, Genesis 3:8, they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day, hadn't caused them any trouble or any alarm before then. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Then the Lord called to the man and said, where are you? He knows where he is, but he wants Adam to realize where he is. Where are you? And he said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. Adam responds with fear. He responds with shame, but not confession. And fig leaves represent that self-righteousness where we try to cover up our shame. The leaves represent that religious appearance and that religious activity that we can feel better about ourselves. And that was not just with Judaism. That happens for me too. There are times when I have so many leaves in my life, so much religious activity and so much religious attitude, but it has nothing to do with the fruit of the Spirit. It has nothing to do with giving God glory. It is going through the motions of religion, going through the motions of church, going through the motions of something that is intellectual. We know the facts about it, but not really to experience that with our soul and with our heart and with our life. And I wonder how many people are in church on this Sunday morning and that they go because they're covering with fig leaves. They're going just simply because it's Sunday. And they're going because this is the time that their church meets. Listen, there's nothing wrong with being in the habit. I'm glad you're in the habit of coming to church. There's some good things about that. But if it's not done for the right reason, then it is no more than fig leaves. It's no more than a box to check off. It's no more than self-righteousness, and that we come and we will confess all of our fear and all of our shame, but we won't confess what really goes on within our heart. And so you see that that's what the leaf represents. It's just an outward appearance, but no real connection. So how can you have fruit? What are the fruit of the Spirit? Galatians 5 makes it real plain. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. And whenever you see the fruit in somebody's life, you're not worried about all the leaves, are you? You don't look at the leaves and say, hey, that's really ministered to me. But whenever you see the fruit of love, and you see somebody in the midst of their life really experience, even in the difficulty, as Philippians tells us in all things, that we can have joy. And you see that joy in their life. Or you see somebody that's kind, and that's just the fruit of their life. You see their faithfulness as they continue to follow God and be obedient to God and give God the glory. You see that fruit of their life. So what is the key to a fruitful life? And that's what it all boils down to. And Jesus, in John chapter 15, uses another agricultural term, and he turns to the grapevine. The key to a fruitful life in John 15:5, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. How would you describe the relationship between the branch and the branch is where the fruit is manifest? It's off the branch, but if the branch is not connected to the vine, then there's no way for it to produce fruit. So you have to look at the relationship not just between the branch and the fruit, but more importantly, between the branch and the vine. And you would have to describe that as dependence. The only way that the branch can bear any fruit and have any significance is how it's attached and how it relates and how it depends upon the vine. If you walk up to fruit, if you walk up to an apple tree and you see an apple and you pluck the apple, you pick it, wipe it off, maybe wash it real good. It looks like an apple, smells like an apple, bites like an apple, tastes like an apple. So you can say, this is an apple tree. Because the fruit is an outward expression of the inward nature of the tree. The fruit is the outward manifestation of the inner nature of the vine. And how can we have a fruitful life? It's not going every day saying, oh man, I've got to go out and I've got to produce this fruit. I've got to put all my effort and concentration how I relate to this fruit. I'm going to produce something that's significant, because all that you will do then is produce leaves. You'll have a lot of covering. You'll have a lot of activity. Your main focus doesn't necessarily need to be in how can I produce the fruit. Your main emphasis ought to be is how do I depend upon the vine? What is my relationship with the vine? How can I depend every day upon the vine? How am I connected to the vine? And then fruit will happen in due season. Some may be here this morning and you say, you know what, my whole life I've been busy about religious activity. I have been in church. I have even joined a church before. I've even said publicly that I believe all this with my head, but I have never truly, the inner nature of my life has never been connected with the vine. And so today, you're an empty and a barren bush, full of leaves, but no fruit. That's the connection for us. Jesus was telling Judaism on its own, it's just a barren tree, and it's cursed. It cannot produce fruit. But if you will connect to the vine, and how do you do that? It is by faith. We're going to look over in the weeks ahead in what Jesus, whenever Peter, Captain Obvious, the next day he comes through and says, hey, Jesus, you cursed this bush. Look, it's dead now. Yeah. And how did Jesus respond to that? He said, have faith in God. Do you want to know the answer of how people who can go through such difficulty and still see God in their life? It's because they're connected to the vine. They're dependent upon Him. And that's why they have real, genuine fruit. Maybe today you've never connected with Christ. How do you do that? You come to God and you turn from trying to do it yourself. You turn from your sin. You confess that to Him. And yes, you can be sorry for that, but without confession, then it's no more than fig leaves. So you come and confess that and turn away from it and turn to Christ. And by faith, believe. And that's where you have the opportunity to respond. that you can trust what God has said that he would do and the finished work that Jesus accomplished on the cross and the wonderful power of God displayed through an empty tomb is real. And as you call upon him, that you can be saved. Maybe you're here today and you've gotten off track. You've gotten things messed up. Aren't you glad that God is a God of another chance? I mean, over and over and over again, how patient God was with Israel. Do you not believe that God is even more patient as you trust in his Son? Maybe you're here today and you know that you're connected, but you've not focused on your connection with the vine. And today as a believer, you need to quit worrying about the leaves, and you need to worry more about or glorify God more about what he is doing in you. Maybe God's laid something else on your heart. You need to be obedient. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for the truth